Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our expert guest, Dr. Bill Mallon. Bill is an Olympic historian and co-founder and past president of the International Society of Olympic Historians. He's also a medical doctor specializing in orthopedic surgery and a former professional golfer. And Bill is joining us today to discuss the history of anti-doping and the Olympics. So Bill, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to start maybe by just having you tell us a little bit more what exactly it means to be an Olympic historian and what you do in this role.
Well, it's mostly a hobby. I was a medical doctor, or still am, and I actually started researching the Olympic Games back in the 1960s. So I've been doing this for almost 60 years. And in the early 90s, it started to become almost more than a hobby as people started reaching out to me as a resource and writing things and now doing podcasts and things like this.
Oh, that's so cool. And I know we interview a lot of athletes on our show, and we're going to focus mostly on your role as an Olympic historian today. But I do want to highlight the point that I made in the introduction that you've played a sport professionally. So can you tell us a little bit more about your golfing career on the PGA Tour?
I played on the PGA Tour from 1975 through part of 1979. I was ranked in the top 100 players in the U.S. for a couple of years. And there wasn't an official world ranking then, but we had a U.S. ranking. And based on that, my world ranking was probably at its best around 45th. So I never won a tournament on tour, although I won about 45 tournaments in my golfing career, amateur and professional. So you can either look at it as I was a bust on the PGA Tour or that at one time I was among the 50 best golfers in the world. And I'll let you choose.
I love it. Well, I've tried my hand at golf and I'm terrible, so I'm impressed. So can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in golf?
I was actually interested in Olympics first and cycling. My father was a competitive cyclist, which was what got me interested in the Olympics. And I grew up in Massachusetts mostly. But in the ninth grade, we moved from Massachusetts to Raleigh, North Carolina. And there just wasn't any competitive cycling down there. I'd been competing a little bit. And we also moved at the beginning of the summer into a new neighborhood where there were no other kids around to play with. I was very bored. And my father said, well, maybe we'll take you to the golf course and you could play there a little bit. I had played golf at that time maybe 5 times in my life. And I started playing golf that summer in Raleigh, and I got pretty good pretty quick. And we moved back to Massachusetts, and I kept playing and started winning tournaments and went to do golf scholarship and just kind of went from there.
Oh, very cool. And you mentioned that your interest in Olympic history started in the 1960s. You started really doing more research into it. How did this interest start?
Well, again, my father was a nationally competitive cyclist, and I'd started competing in cycling when I was actually in junior high. And I liked it. And I had a vacation one time down in New Jersey with an aunt and uncle, and I was near their town library. I went over to their town library. They had a whole bunch of books on the Olympics. So I started reading them, and I got very interested in it, and it just kind of continued.
Gotcha. And I mentioned in the introduction, you're also a co-founder of the International Society of Olympic Historians. Can you tell us a little bit more about the society and what its mission is?
We were founded officially in December of 1991, but through the 1980s, I'd been in correspondence with a number of Olympic historians and people interested in the Olympics around the world. And there was a gentleman in Sweden named Ture Vidland, and Ture and I started talking that we should maybe form a society of all the various people that we corresponded with or sort of had pen pal type relationships with, so we could study the history of the Olympics a little further. And that eventuated in a meeting at a pub in London on December 5th, 1991, where about 10 of us got together and decided to form the International Society of Olympic Historians. The mission is to promote the study of Olympic history. We have a journal that's published 3 times a year. We give out certain awards for the best books and the best papers each year on Olympic history, not just in our journal, but in other sports history journals, mainly just to promote the history of the Olympics and the study of that.
I think that's so cool. And I think it's awesome that you're bringing together people around the world who have this enthusiasm, this interest in Olympic history. Can you talk a little bit about what countries or areas are represented in the society?
Well, we have members from about 80 different countries. You know, we're a little light in Asia. We don't have too much, and we don't have any in Africa that I know of. There might be one in South Africa, but a lot of countries in Europe, US, Canada, Japan. We have a few in China, a few in Australia. So it's very much an international organization.
Very cool. And I understand as part of this, you keep a database of Olympic doping positives dating all the way back to 1968. So how did you get started on this project in particular, Bill?
I'm kind of a maniac about this. I keep a database of everything.
I like it.
I have databases on everything about the Olympics, and the groups I work with, there's a subgroup that I work with. We call ourselves the Only Madmen. It's about the Olympics, and it sort of demonstrates our madness to this hobby. So it was just sort of natural for me to keep a list of who tested positive for doping over the years. I think I first had that list back in the 1980s, maybe 40 years ago. And of course, it's expanded greatly, especially with all the doping problems that arose in London 2012 and Sochi 2014. So now it has just under 500 positive cases at the Olympics. I think it's 498 right now.
Oh, wow. So I'm intrigued here. You mentioned you keep databases on just about everything related to the Olympics. What are some of these other databases?
Well, and this kind of anticipates a closing question. The group I work with, the Only Madmen, we have a website, www.olympedia.org, which is basically the premier Olympic database for results and athlete bios. There's a bio of every Olympic athlete that's ever competed, and it's got every Olympic result in every event, every sport, every year. So the databases started with my databases, but there were a couple other guys in the Only Madmen that were keeping some databases of other things. We kind of combined and merged all these things, and it eventually became olympedia.org.
That is fascinating. So I guess zeroing in on this database of positive doping cases in particular, what kinds of information or data fields does this database contain?
Well, it has the name of the athlete, of course, the nation they're from, the sport they were in, the year in which they competed, that they got dinged for a positive doping offense. And it also has where they finished in the events they competed in originally before the disqualification. And it lists the doping positive, like what drug they were caught for using or what offense they were caught for using, because WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, can get you for things other than a positive drug test. And it has that. It also lists the sources that we used and stuff about appeals, because almost everybody appeals anymore. And if there's a medal reallocation, if the athlete who got caught was a medalist, we talk about the medal reallocation. And again, we list the source. So it's pretty comprehensive. It's got everything you'd want to know. And actually, we put this online a few weeks ago. It's in a Google Sheets database now online, which you can find, I'm sure.
Phenomenal. And I know a lot of our listeners out there may follow the latest news and updates in anti-doping today, but they might be new to some of this history. So can you talk a little bit about why this database starts with the year 1968 as the first year of record?
Yeah, that's because that's the first year that the IOC started testing for drugs at the Olympics. The IOC didn't formally put in bans and penalties into the Olympic Charter until about 1966. I'm not sure. It's 65 or 66. I'm not sure the exact date right now. And even though there were suspected cases before that, it was never really against the rules before that. So nobody was ever officially caught. So they started in 1968. The first athlete caught was a Swedish modern pentathlete. And he actually got caught for alcohol because he had a few beers the night before.
Oh, wow.
Which seems pretty benign now, but that's what he got caught for.
That's fascinating. So is that the first recorded case that you have in the database?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a favorite case that you've recorded?
The favorite cases, I guess, are the famous one. Ben Johnson in 1988 in the 100 meters champion from Canada. Marion Jones, the U.S. sprinter in 2000, of course. Lance Armstrong is in there, the cyclist, and Tyler Hamilton, another well-known professional cyclist who also was eventually caught doping.
Interesting. And it sounds like you've got quite a bit of information packed into this database. And it sounds daunting to me to even think about how you would begin to accumulate all of this information and keep it up to date. So, Bill, what is the process that you use for updating the database and adding new information?
Our group has about 25, but there's one guy that I work with a lot who's a Welshman named Hillary Evans. He said the worst thing that ever happened to him was Hillary Clinton, because now everybody thinks he's female, but he was a male. And Hillary keeps track of a lot of this and sends it to me, and I sort of update the database from a lot of Hillary's stuff. But we receive information from a lot of other people now, people who've sort of become known. We also work with the IOC now. We have a formal relationship with them, and we get information from the IOC about kind of medal reallocations, and we can check with them anytime we have a question about whether so-and-so was disqualified. Sometimes it's not clear when the athlete was actually disqualified, if it was before the Olympics or after and things like that. So we can check with the IOC on that. We have a lot of sources, and it's pretty well documented, too, in case anyone wants to come after us. We keep all the PDFs of the WADA rulings and the CAS, Court of Arbitration for Sport, final rulings on all the various doping penalties. We've got all that information in case anyone says to us, no, this is wrong. And it might be. I mean, I'm not saying we can't make mistakes, and we like to find out what the mistakes are.
Absolutely. So I guess how do you handle situations where there's gaps in the data or information you're missing?
There may be some gaps in the data. I'm not sure we're missing a whole lot of doping positives anymore. And some of it's a gray area about whether this was a doping positive at the Olympics or whether it occurred right before the Olympics, because some of the athletes are tested before the Olympics in pre-games testing and then disqualified. And some people say, well, you shouldn't include this when he didn't actually compete. And I understand that. You can make that case. But we do include those if we know they were caught at the pre-games testing. In addition, though, athletes are tested all sorts of times, other times of the year. And we don't keep track of all doping positives in all sports at other times of the year. Ours is just exclusively related to the Olympics.
Interesting. So do you update things on an ongoing kind of a rolling basis, or is this like an annual project that you set a date and you just sit down and you pump through all the updates?
No, it's done in real time. As soon as we hear about it, we update it. And also, as soon as we confirm it, because there are a lot of reports that so-and-so had a positive test, but the B sample hasn't been tested yet, so they're not certain if it's going to really be a penalty against the athlete. We do usually put that in the database, but we document it, and if it comes back negative, we'll take them out. And in addition, as I said, a lot of these are appealed. Again, we usually keep them in there once the penalty is announced while the appeal is ongoing, but we do make a note that the appeal is still ongoing.
Very interesting. So you mentioned that people are now reaching out to you and very interested in using and getting this information. So what are some of the examples of how this database is being used?
Well, people call me for podcasts, for instance. I mean, the media uses it. I get contacted from the media all the time about, hey, how many doping positives were there? Especially what's been going on with Russia, both with all the doping positives in 2012 and 2014, and now with their absolutely despicable attack on Ukraine. Everybody wants to come down on Russia. So I've had a lot of different media people say, how many positives did Russia have? How many times were they penalized in 2012 or 2014? It seems like everybody wants to know about what's going on with Russia, especially because so many people want to ban them from the Olympics right now.
So what have been some of your biggest takeaways or maybe some of the biggest surprises from keeping this list?
Well, not only that Russia has had a lot of doping positives over the last 12 years especially, but many of the doping positives during that time, if you list the number of positives by nation and list like the top 10 nations for doping positives, it's not just Russia, it's a lot of the other former Soviet republics like Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine even, unfortunately. But it's not limited to that. The United States has certainly had their doping positives. I mean, Marion Jones and Lance Armstrong are famous cases, and there's a few other famous cases the U.S. had too. So it's sort of worldwide, although if you look at which nations are doing it sort of as a systemic national plan, it almost certainly seems to be Russia.
So I guess looking back, now that you've got this database, it's probably hard to make any major changes. Are there any things that you wish you would have done differently?
I think we've got everything in there, and the fields that we have is pretty comprehensive, and we've added a few of them over the years. I don't think we had everything at the beginning when I was keeping it for certain. I know we didn't, but it was fairly easy to add them, mainly because the big bulk of these have occurred in 2012 and 14 when the IOC caught so many positives, especially London and Sochi.
Definitely. And London has come up a few times in our conversation now so far. So let's dive into it. Of course, we recently saw some new positive findings emerging years after the London Olympic Games from 2012. So can you talk a little bit about what's happening in these situations and why medals in some of these cases are still changing hands even a decade later?
It's kind of complicated about the medals changing hands, but what's happened with London and Sochi was the technology to test urine and blood and detect performance-enhancing drugs greatly increased in the early 2000s and around 2010. And athletes used to be able to take certain types of drugs, and they knew that they could get away with it because the detection was not that sensitive. Well, they sort of kept doing that, but now the systems for detecting the performance-enhancing drugs were so much more sensitive that it caught everybody in 2012, 2014. This actually has happened before. A similar thing happened back in 1987 at the Pan American Games when the testing got very sensitive again at that point. But it happened way more in 2012, 14, and even a little bit in 16. So there's hundreds of cases from the last 2 years that we've added on. As far as the medal reallocations, this is a complicated thing that most people don't understand. The media doesn't understand it sometimes either. When someone tests positive, who's a medalist, let's say a gold medalist has a positive drug test and the IOC says they're disqualified and the medal is taken away. Everybody assumes, well, the silver medalist will move up and get a gold medal, the bronze medalist will move up and get a silver, and the fourth place will get a bronze medal. And that's not true. The placements at the Olympic Games are determined by the international federations. The World Athletics for track and field, FINA, the Swimming International Federation, determines the placements. And when they disqualify an athlete for drug use, FINA or World Athletics or the other international federations will move up all the other athletes. However, the medals are given out by the International Olympic Committee, and they determine whether athletes get a medal, and they determine if those medals will be reallocated. And it usually has to go through both an appeals process from the original medalist, and the IOC Executive Committee looks at the athletes that would move up, and sometimes they don't move them up. Usually they don't move them up if they have a previous drug test that was positive because they don't think that's correct. And there's some legal questions about whether they can do that, but that's what they do. So the media is wrong, and people are usually wrong when they say, oh, the silver medalist now gets the gold medal. Well, probably they do, but not 100% of the time. And if they do, it takes a while for that to occur. It certainly doesn't occur immediately or automatically.
That's very interesting. And I know this is something, as you alluded to, there are patterns that you've seen in the data, sort of these spikes that correspond with increased sensitivity of testing that lead to more positives. Are there other interesting patterns that you've noticed in the data that you've collected?
There's more and more drugs on the WADA proscribed list. They have a list of drugs, and it changes every year. They put out a new list. Initially, the only things on the list was anabolic steroids and amphetamines back in the 60s and 70s. That was the only thing that was tested for. But now there's all sorts of things on there, EPO, erythropoietin. There are other drugs that are felt to be blocking agents. They may not necessarily be performance enhancing by themselves, but they prevent the detection of some of the performance enhancing drugs. So people take them sometimes to avoid being caught. So those are on the list because they don't want people taking blocking agents. And there's just a lot more agents that are on there. In addition, as I said, you don't necessarily have to have a positive drug test to get dinged for doping. They have a thing called whereabouts problems, which means in the world of international sport, the athletes are tested 24/7, 365 on an unannounced basis, which is not true in the United States in the professional sports leagues. They are not tested 24/7, 365 because all the U.S. sports leagues have player unions and they don't permit that. But these athletes can be tested at any time of day. And in order to do that, they have to have an app on their phones and be in contact with their international federation, telling everyone where they are all the time. You got to tell them where you are tomorrow at 4 a.m. So if someone wants to come test you at 4 a.m., they can do it. It's really actually pretty obtrusive on the athletes' lives, the way they have to report this. And if you don't report that 3 times, it's called 3 whereabout penalties, and you're then disqualified because it counts as a doping positive, even though you never were caught doping, because they think you're trying to evade being tested. So that's one way that people can be caught without having a positive test. Another thing is there's sort of indirect evidence that you were doping. If you got an IV, even if they don't know what drugs were put in, well, you can't have IV medications anymore without a doctor's order unless you're in the hospital. Things like that. If there's any evidence you did blood doping, they also test blood levels from time to time to see if your hematocrit has gone up in an unusual way, which could be evidence of blood doping. They also test another level of your blood counts called reticulocytes, which are immature blood cells, which may indicate that you've been blood doping as well. So there's several different ways you can have a positive doping test anymore without ever having tested positive for a drug.
Definitely. And your database captures all of this information.
Well, yeah, we mentioned what the penalty was, if it was a whereabouts problem or if they were caught because of abnormal lab values or things like that.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And thinking about the span of Olympic history that you've covered, do you think sport is cleaner now today than it was maybe when you started keeping this database?
Well, I think sport is cleaner now.
Now I'll put on my professional golfer hat. I played professional sports, and I knew a lot of professional athletes in other sports. Professional athletes will do almost anything to become better at being an athlete. They will push the limit very much. And when I hear about athletes testing positive and they say, no, I never took anything, I usually don't believe it. On the other hand, I think we're getting to the point where it's going to become cleaner because the test is getting so sensitive. They know they just can't take anything or they'll get caught.
Definitely. I think these deterrent effects are very powerful of these anti-doping programs because, as you mentioned, this is a life-altering situation if you get a positive test and if you have to go through the process and maybe are not able to compete in the Olympics or might have a medal stripped away. So I think that deterrent effect is definitely there. And Bill, we appreciate you sharing your insights. And if our listeners want to learn more about you, more about the work that you've been doing as an Olympic historian, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, they can go to olympedia.org. It's Olympedia, just sort of like Wikipedia, but with an Olymp at the beginning. The other thing they can do if they want is follow me on Twitter, because we usually post things about doping positive. Hillary and I both, are on Twitter and post a lot of stuff about it. My Twitter handle is BamBam1729, 1729. Bam Bam is like as in the Flintstone baby.
Oh, I like it. Well, listeners, definitely follow Bill on Twitter. Check out that website to learn more. And Bill, it's been such a pleasure to have you with us on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
No worries, Marie. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Listeners, it's been great to have you here as well. Thank you so much for tuning in. And when you have a moment, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to share what you think of the show. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.